The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everybody. This is Megan Parker with the New York Association on Independent Living. Welcome and thank you for joining today's presentation. Today's webinar will be on the Disability Integration Act, and our presenter is Stephanie Woodward. Stephanie is the Director of Advocacy for the Center for Disability Rights and a national organizer with ADAPT. In addition, Stephanie was integral in the development of this important piece of legislation and will be lending her expertise to us today on today's webinar. For today's presentation, everyone will be in listen-only mode. However, you can submit a question anytime through the questions pane. Simply type in your question and click send, and we will leave time at the end of the presentation to answer all questions. If for some reason we don't have time to answer questions, we will make sure to get back to you following the webinar. In addition, I will be emailing everybody a copy of the PowerPoint for today's slides, so look for that in your email following today's presentation. We will also be recording the webinar and posting it to NYAIL's website in the coming days, so look out for that. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our presenter, Stephanie Woodward.
Thanks, Megan, and thank you all for joining us today. I'm really excited to talk to you all about the Disability Integration Act. And the basis of it was to create an absolute right for people with disabilities to live in the community. So we're going to go straight to the next slide to talk about just the basics of the Disability Integration Act. It is major disability rights legislation, much like the ADA and other disability rights bills that you are familiar with. In the Senate, it is S910, and it was introduced by Minority Leader Schumer. And for us, that was a big deal. He was the initial sponsor in our previous Congress, back when it was S2427, but now it's S910. And when Schumer became Minority Leader, he did drop a lot of the bills that he was leading, but chose to keep the Disability Integration Act. And for us, that speaks volumes as to how much it means to him as a New Yorker, and also just how much it means to our disability community across the nation to have a bill that would secure people's right to live in the community. And in the House, the bill is H.R. 2472, and it's led by Congressman Sensenbrenner, who is Republican from Wisconsin. Congressman Sensenbrenner was also a big supporter of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So it's really nice to have someone who is familiar with the disability community being supporters of this act. I do want to point out that in the Senate, we have 21 co-sponsors across 16 states. And the bill is going through the Health Committee, which is Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions. And in the House, we have 96 co-sponsors across 28 states, as well as the District of Columbia and America Samoa. And the committees that it's in there are, it's the Health Subcommittee of Energy and Commerce and the Constitutional Civil Justice Subcommittee of the Judiciary Committee. So this slide right here really gives the foundation of where we thought of the Disability Integration Act. So in 2013, Senator Harkin published a report from the Health Committee entitled Separate and Unequal, and identified that states are failing to fulfill the community living promise of the ADA. And this report identified that 25 years after the ADA at that point, and 14 years after Olmstead, disabled people were still facing far too many barriers to community living and being forced into institutional settings. So the next slide goes into a little bit of why we need the Disability Integration Act. The states right now are not focused on transitioning people back into the community. The report from the Health Committee stated many states have focused more on enrolling people that are currently living in community settings into home and community-based programs than transitioning individuals living in institutional settings back into the community. So that's really important, is that we're helping people in the community to stay in the community, but we're not helping people who are in institutions get into the community. The HELP report also identified that states have continued to backfill institutional beds rather than closing them and reallocating those institutional dollars to support individuals in their own homes and communities. So again, states are continuing to put people into facility settings and institutional settings rather than reallocate those dollars to community-based settings. The report also found that when people are transitioned, it remains unclear if they're being transitioned into the most integrated setting possible or merely just a less institutional setting. So going from a facility to, say, a group home, rather than from a facility and into your own home in the community. So these are all findings from the 2013 HELP Committee report, and that's the foundation of where the Disability Integration Act came from. So on the next slide, the Senate HELP Committee gave one primary recommendation, which is that Congress should amend the ADA to clarify and strengthen the law's integration mandate in a manner that accelerates Olmstead implementation and clarifies that every individual who is eligible for LTSS, which is long-term services and supports under Medicaid, has a federally protected right to a real choice in how they receive supports and services. So how does the DIA do this? First of all, does the DIA amend the ADA as suggested in the HELP report? No, it does not create an amendment to the ADA. Instead, the Disability Integration Act is a separate and new law. This was very intentional. When we talk about amending the ADA, we open up the ADA for a lot of changes, and not just the changes that we like. Sometimes changes that we don't like also get into amendments, which is why we felt it was important to keep the Disability Integration Act as a separate law rather than an amendment to the ADA. But it does follow the language of the ADA in that it is structured to be very rights-based, and the language used in the ADA is also used in the Disability Integration Act to make sure that they are congruent with each other. It would be a civil rights legislation, not Medicaid. So the HELP report said that people who have Medicaid have the right to real supports and how they choose services and supports. For us, we don't believe you just have to be on Medicaid and to have a real choice in how you live. We believe that rights follow people, and programs can be evaded. And what I mean by that is Medicaid is, well, it's huge. And when we're looking at things like ACA repeal and other things like that, what we found is it's very easy to just redline out a few words in Medicaid law. We don't want that to happen for people living with disabilities trying to live in the community. So that's why this would be an entirely separate new law, because it's a lot harder to get rid of a law. As you saw with the ADA and HR 620, they're already trying to bring down the rights of people with disabilities. If it was easy to just cross it out in a different piece of legislation, then our rights would be at risk far too often. Whereas if we create a separate law affirming our rights through a civil rights framework, it's a lot harder to get rid of that. And this law would establish the right to choose where you receive your supports and services. So you can choose to get them in an assisted living, in a nursing facility, in the community, in a group home. It's really just about choice, because right now there theoretically may be a choice, but in reality the structures are not set up to allow people to have the real choice to live in the community. So on the next slide, we bring this back to our very basics of our foundation of our country. The Declaration of Independence says, we hold the truth to be self-evident that all men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And for us, we really focus on life and liberty within the Disability Integration Act, because for us, life is not just about your ability to breathe. Life is your connection with your community, living as all other humans live, really having a full chance to participate in activities. And liberty is that freedom. I don't think anyone is going to argue with me that you don't have liberty when you're living in a facility or an institution. When you can't choose what day you want to shower, I can't say that that's living in freedom. So moving to the next slide, we have to think about who does the Declaration of Independence, who do all of these rights belong to? All men are created equal. I would argue that at this point it's not all men. We would say all people. And we are equal in all rights, disabled people included. We can't just say that life and liberty is for all Americans unless they're disabled, in which case we have to look at the price and do a cost analysis on whether or not they can actually live in freedom. That is not what our American foundations are based on. Our American foundations are based on the fact that we are all created equal and we all have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which means we have to allow disabled people to have those same opportunities. So moving to the next slide, when looking at the Disability Integration Act, we call the right to live in the community right number 0 because it's something that is not listed anywhere because we don't even think about it. People naturally live in the community. People don't think about the fact that they live in the community because it is so inherent and basic. So for you to exercise your liberty and pursuit of happiness to live in the community is so basic that you probably don't know that you're doing it. It's so fundamental that you don't think of it as a right. And for disabled people who have been institutionalized, we have a very different framework, which is why on the image on this slide, you'll see a goldfish that says, "How's the water?" and then 4 other goldfish saying, "What the hell is water?" Because it's so inherent to them that what they're in that they hadn't even thought about it. And that's what community living is for most Americans. You may not like the house that you live in, but you've never actually questioned or thought about the fact that you live in the community. You have not been forced to live in any sort of institutional setting against your will. So moving to the next slide, the right for all people with disabilities to live in the community. If people don't have the right to live in the community, you can't exercise their rights under the ADA. So the Disability Integration Act recognized this, and in the very beginning of the Disability Integration Act, it stated that the right to live in the community is necessary for the exercise of the civil rights that the ADA was intended to secure for all individuals with disabilities. The lack of adequate community-based services and supports has imperiled the civil rights of all individuals with disabilities and has undermined the very promise of the ADA. Therefore, it is necessary to recognize in statute a robust and fully articulated right to live in the community. So essentially what that's saying is, if you don't have the right to live in the community, a real right with real services that allow you to live in the community, then the ADA means nothing. The ADA doesn't mean a darn thing to someone in a nursing facility who can't get out. They don't care that they have the right to access through the community with curb cuts or the right to work because they can't get out of the nursing facility to enjoy those rights. And while we can say that Olmstead has created the right to live in the community, it hasn't created the structure that allows it to happen. So the Disability Integration Act would recognize in statute this right to community living and have the services and supports built in that structure to make it happen. I'm moving to the next slide. I'm talking about how would the Disability Integration Act work. The Disability Integration Act would prohibit Medicaid or any other insurance provider from denying community-based services to an individual who is ineligible for institutional placement. So for us, that means that's really important. It's not just Medicaid, it's any insurance provider, because again, we believe this right is for all people, not just Medicaid recipients, although Medicaid recipients are the people who are more likely to be in facilities because Medicaid is the highest payer of long-term services and supports, and oftentimes that's an institutional long-term services and support. But we open this up to all insurance companies that would cover the institutional placement. So not all insurance companies cover institutional placement, but if you do have a private insurer that would cover it, then that would be eligible as well. And the exact language used in the bill is that no public entity or LTSS insurance provider, and again, LTSS being long-term services and supports, shall deny any individual with an LTSS disability who is eligible for institutional placement or otherwise discriminate against that individual in the provision of community-based long-term services and supports that enable the individual to live in the community and lead an independent life. So you cannot deny a person the ability to live in the community. If you would let them live in an institutional placement and pay for it, you must also allow that individual to live in the community and pay for it. So now we're going to go through a little bit of the nitty-gritty starting with the next slide. So what do we mean by public entity or LTSS insurance provider? Public entity is any entity that funds or provides ADLs, which is activities of daily living, IADLs, instrumental activities of daily living, or health-related tasks. And it's often state or local government. An LTSS insurance provider would pay for the same things, but operate in interstate commerce. So that's essentially any insurance provider that would pay for an institutional setting. So the next slide, we get into who's eligible under the Disability Integration Act. And those who are eligible are individuals with LTSS disabilities. So it wouldn't be all disabled people are eligible, because this law was specifically meant to target the disabled people who have been left behind by the ADA. It's people who are stuck in nursing facilities or at risk of going to institutions. So it's not just anyone with a disability. It's a person with a disability who needs long-term services and support. So we start with the definition of person with disability under the ADA, and then we add two requirements. First, they require assistance with ADLs, IADLs, or health-related tasks. And second, that they are either in an institution or at risk of institutionalization, because the Disability Integration Act wants to be very clear that you shouldn't have to go into an institution in order to have rights under the Disability Integration Act. Also, if you are at risk of institutionalization, because we don't ever want someone to have to go into an institution just to get into the community. If you're already in the community, but you're at risk of institutionalization because you have these long-term service and support needs, then you would be an eligible person under the Disability Integration Act. The next slide, we're going to get into what does community-based mean. So we got really into this because some of you may be familiar with the settings rules, where there was a lot of controversy over what counts as community-based. And we wanted to be very clear that anything that resembles an institutional setting is not considered community-based under the Disability Integration Act. So we're very clear that what constitutes as community-based includes a dwelling owned by the individual or their family. So that could be a house owned by the individual with disability who qualifies under the ADA, or it could be their wife owns it, their daughter owns it, something owned by the person or their family. A dwelling rented under the same terms as an ordinary lease. So that means that you can't put additional provisions on that simply because the person is disabled. So that means you can't require someone to get their services from the same provider that provides the housing. You can't have those additional requirements. It has to be a dwelling that's rented under the same terms as any ordinary lease. And with group settings, it can be up to 4 people with disabilities who have control of the access of their home, which means they can come and go whenever they want. They can eat whenever they want. They have the same terms as an ordinary lease. They can have guests, and their tenancy, again, is not tied to their services. So the landlord is not also the service provider. And then we left open, in general, other settings in the community. But we wanted to be very clear on what community-based means. So this is not to be the be-all, end-all of it, but this is to clearly define that some group homes where an individual does not have control of their own home would not count as community-based. On the next slide, we're getting into long-term services and supports. So I'm sure a lot of you are already familiar with this, but the services and supports that would be available to individuals include activities of daily living, such as eating, bathing, dressing, toileting, and transferring. Instrumental activities of daily living, including housework, meal prep, money management, care of others, also queuing, things like that. And then health-related tasks, which are non-acute tasks that are often viewed as medical tasks, which can include medication administration, ventilator use, ostomy, or catheter use as well, which are really critical tasks for some individuals with disabilities, and other tasks that are related to above. Again, we always try to include a catch-all because we recognize that as time goes on, things can change. We've seen what has happened with 28 years after the ADA and how far our country and our technology and our systems have progressed. So we always try to include that catch-all language just so that it's clear that as our society continues to grow and change, that this would all still apply. Going into the next slide, the Disability Integration Act has one basic prohibition. If Medicaid or a different insurance provider would pay for a person to go to a nursing home, then they must pay for them to also receive the same services and supports to live in the community, which means you cannot offer someone nursing facility placement and not also offer them a real choice to live in the community. That is the entire basis of the Disability Integration Act. The next slide goes into what does that mean? That means it's about choice. It's not about forcing an individual to make any decisions. It's really about making a choice. So the Disability Integration Act would not undercut your ability to choose institutional placement. There are some people who really want to live in a nursing facility. It's not me. I don't know why they choose it, but they choose it. And this would not in any way undercut that ability. It does not restrict any sort of funding to assisted living or to group homes. It simply ensures that people with disabilities have a real choice to live in the community. So the states, through state Medicaid and private insurers, are only required to assure that the person has a real choice to live in the community. And that's all that this is about. So we don't want anyone to be concerned that if you really wanted to go to a nursing facility, you couldn't go. You certainly could. But what we're facing in our country is not a whole bunch of people who want to go to nursing facilities who can't get in. What we're facing is a whole bunch of people who don't want to be in facilities who can't get out, which is why the Disability Integration Act forces that choice. So forces the insurance providers to provide the choice for individuals. So on the next slide, we're going to get into the 11 specific prohibitions that are listed in the Disability Integration Act. And these were specifically written in based on what we're seeing people being denied for services for currently. So insurance providers cannot screen out people by eligibility. So you can't say things like, you've got the wrong disability. They cannot impose service or cost caps. They cannot say that we'll only pay for X amount and then after that you're on your own. They can't fail to provide a specific service that the individual needs. They cannot screen out eligibility by regulations or requirements. Again, like you must have acquired your disability by age 26 or else you're not eligible for this service. They can't do that. On the next slide, we're going into the other prohibitions. Number 5 is a huge one for us. It's imposing waiting lists. Insurers cannot put someone on a waiting list, and this is something that we're seeing all the time. And you may think that New York is progressive, but we're seeing waiting lists everywhere. In Alabama, we've got a 7-year waiting list to get community supports and services. In Utah, there's a 4-year waiting list. People are dying on waiting lists before they ever can get into the community. Number 6 is also a huge one that we feel is incredibly important. Insurers cannot provide inadequate payment to support a workforce. And what that means is insurers cannot pay such low wages that attendants don't want to work in the community. And that's what we're seeing right now, is that attendants receive such low wages that they can't afford to be attendants. And therefore, people are forced into institutions simply because they cannot find attendants to assist them. So this was written in a broad way, specifically inadequate payment to support a workforce, because we recognize that we cannot set a number on what adequate payment is. We have 50 states with different regions throughout every state, and what counts as adequate in one area of California may be more than adequate in Wisconsin, or maybe inadequate in New York City. So it's the provision is that they cannot provide inadequate payment to support a workforce, and that is supposed to be based essentially on the region in which people are in. Number 7 is that they cannot fail to provide intermittent supports and services. And what that means is there are some people who do not need services, even on a daily or weekly basis. Some people with episodic disabilities only need intermittent supports and services, and insurance providers cannot fail to provide that. One that we think is specifically important, well, they all are important, this one really hits home to a lot of people, is that insurance providers cannot require the use of informal supports. Oftentimes, this is used as a way to cut hours for an individual or approve lower hours, is to say that they have informal supports that can provide that. And while informal supports are certainly welcome if they are voluntary and desired by both the person providing the support and the person receiving the support, it cannot be required of the insurance provider. If a person does not want their mom helping them, then they should not have to be forced to have it on them. And vice versa. If the mother does not want to help their 27-year-old child, they shouldn't be forced to do that simply because they are an informal support in the eyes of the insurance provider. So that's really critical, that that cannot be required. And then the last slide of this section about the specific prohibitions, you cannot fail to offer community-based services before institutionalization. So they can't say, well, first you go to the institution, then you can try to get in the community. They must offer them both at the same time and make them both viable options. They cannot fail to notify people who are already in institutions of their right to live in the community. What that means is, say the Disability Integration Act passes in 2019, and there are already plenty of people in nursing facilities, you have to tell people that, hey, this law is the law now, and you have the right to live in the community. Do you want to do that? And the last one is you cannot fail to make reasonable accommodations to allow a person to live in the community. So we recognize that everything that was written in the Disability Integration Act may not be exactly what a disabled person needs, because every disabled person is different. So if you need a specific reasonable accommodation, in addition to everything that's listed in the DIA to allow you to live in the community, then the insurance provider must also make that reasonable accommodation as well. So on the next slide, how does the Disability Integration Act support informal caregivers? First, we're excited to say that it does. So although the bill focuses on the needs of people with LTSS disabilities, we recognize that informal supports are a really important resource. So not to get too nerdy on you, but Section 6B, 2D of the Disability Integration Act requires that the public entity or LTSS insurance provider assure the federal government that it supports informal caregivers who provide services for individuals with LTSS, which means if a person chooses to receive support from an informal support, and that person also volunteers those services, so they both agree that they want it, the insurance company still must support that informal caregiver. So first, you can't require informal caregivers, but second, if informal caregiving is what is wanted, you must support those individuals. So the next slide, are there any other prohibitions? Yeah, we love prohibitions, apparently. There's a specific prohibition for public entities. Public entities cannot fail to ensure that there is a sufficient amount of affordable, accessible, integrated housing. And why is this included? We get this question all the time. They're like, whoa, this throws me off. Where did this housing thing come from? We recognize that people cannot transition from facilities and into the community if there is not affordable, accessible, integrated housing that allows someone to live in the community and choose where they live and where they receive those services. So this simply means that the public entity has to ensure that there's enough accessible housing in the community for people with disabilities to live in, and that that housing has to be affordable and integrated in the community. So it doesn't tell the states how to get it done. It doesn't tell the states how they have to provide the affordable, accessible, integrated housing. They simply have to do it. And this is very intentional because every state is different. Well, a tax credit to create accessible housing may work well in one state, it may not work well in another. So that is why it gives the direction on what to do, but not the specifics on how to get it done, because each state can choose that. So on the next slide, we're going to get into how would the Disability Integration Act actually work. So once the Disability Integration Act is passed, there will be 18 months in which regulations would be written. So first, the bill is signed into law, and then there will be an 18-month period where regulations that go along with the Disability Integration Act will be written. Very much like the Americans with Disability Act is the law, there is regulations to go along with it. So there will be an 18-month period to allow those regulations to be written. And then there will be self-assessments, which means public entities and insurance providers that are LTSS insurance providers have to complete a self-assessment of, hey, where am I? How well am I already providing these services in the community? They have to do that self-assessment within 12 months. This allows them that time to really reflect on what they're doing, either as a state or an insurer, to figure out how they need to improve to get people in the community. And then there is going to be a 10-year transition period. And some people cringe when they hear that. Why do I have to wait 10 years to live in the community? I hate saying this, but change can't happen in a day. And we recognize that, well, this would be a much smoother transition for more progressive states that are already offering community-based supports and services. For states that are far behind the ball, 10 years is what's necessary just to create and start transitioning fully into that. And for states, the law will make it easier by providing a 5% federal enhanced FMAP for certain costs which are identified in the transition plan. So the FMAP is federal matching for Medicaid dollars. Very much like New York State has implemented the Community First Choice option, where we get additional FMAP for community-based costs, the services, things like that. The Disability Integration Act would offer a 5% enhanced FMAP for these transitions. And the sooner the state starts their transition, the sooner they can draw down on that FMAP. So that is what would encourage states to start in year one. Don't wait until year 3 of the 10-year period to get going, because the sooner you start, the sooner you can get that enhanced matching. And 5% may not sound like a lot to you, but it can equate to, in New York State's case, I believe around $365 million a year. And that's just through CFC. So imagine what the Disability Integration Act could do for the entire United States. On the next slide, we're getting into how this will actually work. As I said before about the housing, all of DIA is the same. The Disability Integration Act specifies what has to be done, not how to do it. States and insurers are going to decide how they're going to get to the end point. The federal government will review those plans and incentivize the states through that additional FMAP. But in the end, it's really up to the states and the insurers to decide how they're going to reach those goals. It's very much like the Americans with Disabilities Act says, restaurants and other public accommodations have to be accessible. It doesn't say, and this is how to build your ramp, this is exactly where it must go. There are certainly regulations saying here's how the slope of a ramp should be, but it doesn't tell you where to put the ramp, what color it should be, things like that. It simply says you got to let people get in. And perhaps you don't even choose a ramp. Perhaps you just choose a business that has no steps to get in and no slope. That's great too. So much like the ADA says, hey, it's got to be accessible, but doesn't tell you how to get there, the Disability Integration Act says, hey, you have to let people live in the community, but it doesn't tell you how to do it because every state is different and will take a different path to get there. On the next slide, we're talking about enforcement. So the Department of Justice, under the Disability Integration Act, can bring cases against states and insurance companies for discrimination. That is also allowed under the Americans with Disabilities Act. In this case, individuals can also bring cases, just like under the ADA. But what's different about the Disability Integration Act is that courts would be allowed to award punitive damages. Punitive damages are not allowed under the Americans with Disabilities Act. And what we've seen from that is it really takes a lot of teeth out of the ADA. Oh, I don't know if I'm valid right now.
We can hear you. We can hear you.
Oh, wonderful. So, as I was saying, punitive damages are really important because it incentivizes insurance companies or states to really follow the letter of the law from the start. Because right now with the ADA, without punitive damages, there's really not any incentive for businesses to comply with the ADA until they're sued. And then they can do it. But there's really no big threat, which is why punitive damages kind of allow a little bit more of a threat so that it would incentivize states and insurance companies to comply sooner. On the next slide, now we're getting into the good stuff. What can you do to help? Because we really want to get the Disability Integration Act passed so that more people with disabilities can truly have the right to live in the community. First, specifically in New York State, you can contact your representatives, and I'll get a little bit further into that in the coming slides. But you can also let us know about your advocacy on a website called c4ci.org, and I'll get a little bit more into that as well. You can sign your organization or other organizations that want to be a supporter up as a supporter, and I'll tell you how to do that. And you can ask other people to do the exact same things, and I'm going to get a little bit further into detail with you. So for the next slide, asking your representative to co-sponsor. The next two slides I list the New York State representatives who are not yet co-sponsors of the Disability Integration Act. And yes, I do recognize that we are going to have an election coming up, so these names will change. Notably, Crowley will likely not be listed since he did not get that primary election, but a lot of them may be the same or different. The point is these districts do not have the representatives on. And so we would really like New Yorkers who do live in these specific districts to reach out to their representatives and push them to sign into the Disability Integration Act. So we have Chris Collins from New York 27, Joe Crowley from New York 14, Adriana Espiat from New York 13, John Faso from New York 19, John Katko from New York 24, Pete King from New York 2, and then on our next slide, Nita Lowy from New York 17, Carolyn Maloney from New York 12, Gregory Meeks from New York 5, Tom Reed from New York 23, Elisa Stefanik from New York 21, Claudia Tenney from New York 22, and Lee Zelding from New York 1. So each of these individuals has not yet signed on to the Disability Integration Act. So not only could you reach out to these individuals and ask them to sign on, but if they are in, say, an election year, you could also reach out to the other people running for those seats and say, hey, if you were elected, would you support the Disability Integration Act? Because it's important for the disability community that you serve to know who supports their right to live in the community. So the strategy for us is always to reach out to anybody running for a seat to ask them, do you support the Disability Integration Act? And if elected, would you co-sponsor? Because that helps our constituents and our consumers to make informed decisions about who they want to vote for. The next slide gets into how you can tell us about your advocacy. So the website is called c4ci.org, and I believe that stands for something, and I wish I could tell you. It's something for communityintegration.org. The first C I'm escaping me right now. So what you would do at c4ci.org is you could use the search database function, and this is an entire database that lists every congressperson And you can search that database and find your congressperson. And what you're going to do when you do that is you can click on their name, and it will tell you all of the times someone has contacted that person before and told us about it. So say I've contacted Chris Collins before, and you search the database for Chris Collins, you would see something that says Stephanie Woodward spoke with Chris Collins' office on July 5th at their legislative breakfast and asked to sign on to the Disability Integration Act. And say you also called, you could click add a contact note and tell us about the communication that you had. This allows people from your district who also want to participate in advocacy to see who else has contacted that representative, because oftentimes what we'll hear is someone say, well, this is the first time we've ever heard about this bill. And in fact, we can go back to the C4CI website and say, actually, I know for a fact that you've been talked to about this bill 3 times. I know that someone from your district named John contacted you on July 10th by phone and asked you to sign on. So this just allows us to really have a great tool to use for our advocacy and show the tenacity, and also help us identify what may be issues that need to be resolved. So if you contacted your representative and they said, I really have a question about the bill, and you don't know the answer, you could also put that into C4CI that someone else may be able to answer that for you. So I can tell you I regularly look at this website, so if someone says, hey, they had a question about the fiscal attached to this, I could then reach out and say, hi, I know that you met with John. My name's Stephanie. I wanted to answer your question about the fiscal. And then if you don't know what to say at all, there are tailored talking points for every representative on C4CI. And these talking points get into things like, if you picked Carolyn Maloney, it may tell you, first it will tell you other bills that she's sponsored that are similar to the Disability Integration Act. It will tell you previous iterations of this bill that she may have sponsored. So it gives you talking points, because sometimes you really want to help, you just don't know what to say. And this allows you to really be empowered to know what to say. So every single person in there has tailored talking points specific for that congressperson. On the next slide, it talks about how you, as your organization, can sign up as a supporter. So disabilityintegrationact.org, first, is just a great place to get resources. But we have a tab, or you could use the link specifically in these slides, that allows you to sign your agency up as a supporter of the Disability Integration Act. So we have tons of disability rights groups and independent living centers. But you can also encourage other organizations that simply support civil or constitutional rights. For example, the ACLU and the Human Rights Campaign have both signed on as supporters of the Disability Integration Act. They're not disability-specific organizations, but they support the right of disabled people to live in the community. And we also have really great resources, including legislative packets that you could just print out and bring to meetings with your legislator. And they are separated by parties, because we tend to get different questions from Democrats than we do Republicans. So we've created 2 information packs that essentially provide the exact same information, but answer the different questions that we've been getting from the Democratic Party versus the Republican Party. So you could say, hey, I'm meeting with my representative, they're a Democrat, I'm going to print out the Democrat packet and go have a meeting with them. And this packet provides information such as an overview of the bill, who is supporting the bill. It includes a letter from Olmstead litigators saying that the Disability Integration Act is necessary in order to really support the rights of disabled people to live in the community, and many other resources that really help to show how widespread the support is for the Disability Integration Act. And with that, I think I'm doing well on time. Our last slide allows for questions. If you have any questions, first, I certainly recommend you start with disabilityintegrationact.org. It's just a wealth of resources for anyone who wants to advocate for the bill and learn more about it. But you can also contact us at dia@cdrnys.org anytime, and either I or someone on my team will give you an answer to any question you might have. But at this point, I would certainly welcome your questions now, and I'd be happy to answer them on either the bill or how you can advocate for it.
So
We have one question from Chanel. She was asking if we can email the slides, which of course we will send those out to everyone. I don't see any other questions so far. Does anyone else have a question?
So you can click on the hand on your screen to raise your hand to ask a question, or type the question in the questions pane and we will read it out. And Stephanie, while we're waiting for those questions to come in, we looked up while you what C4CI stands for while you were doing the presentation, and it's Coalition for Community Integration.
I knew there was a reason there was another C in there. Thank goodness that someone was prepared for this.
I thought it might help people remember it. Okay. Well, Stephanie, I guess you did such an excellent job going through this legislation. You really did. I mean, you really hit all the points. But it doesn't appear we have any questions right now. Of course, you did provide your contact information, and so if people have questions later, please feel free to reach out either to me or Stephanie, and we'll make sure to get that question answered. I will be sending out the slides following the presentation. And thank you guys all for joining us today. And Stephanie, thank you so much.
For all your future support on the Disability Integration Act.